Did you ever sleep at the foot of the bed when the weather was a whistling cold? I thought, well, this is about as far as I can go.
Right.
Oh, yeah, that's the way I thought.
So you went around the world from there.
Everyone in Nashville thought they knew him. The man in the rhinestone suit, barely 4'10", who could light up the Grand Ole Opry with a single joke. For more than 70 years, Little Jimmy Dickens was laughter itself, the smiling face of country music. But behind the sequins and the laughter, he carried a truth no one ever asked about. In his final years, at 94, Jimmy Dickens spoke words that silenced even the noisiest crowds. It wasn't a scandal, it wasn't regret, it was something far deeper. The truth of a man who gave everything to a world that barely remembered his name. The cameras caught his final show in Nashville. A trembling voice, a small hand waving to fans who had grown old with him. What no one knew was that this would be his last night on stage. Hours later, he told a close friend, "I used to think applause was love, but when the lights fade, you learn it's not the same thing." The world would soon lose one of its most beloved legends. But before he left, Jimmy Dickens made one final confession, one that would change how fans saw country music forever. Because the truth behind that smile is much darker.
He was born in a coal town in West Virginia, in the middle of the Great Depression, a place where dreams didn't last long, and laughter was the only medicine people could afford. James Cecil Dickens, long before the world knew him as Little Jimmy, grew up surrounded by hard work, coal dust, and silence. His father worked in the mines. His mother tried to keep faith alive with songs from the local church. Jimmy was the youngest of 13 children, a quiet boy with a voice that seemed too pure for the rough hills around him. At night, he'd sit on the porch with a battered guitar, singing old folk hymns to the mountains. Music, for him, wasn't a hobby, it was escape. He never grew tall. By his teens, doctors told him he'd stopped growing, a genetic quirk that would define his whole life. At 5 feet, then 4'10", he became the target of jokes at school, but never stopped smiling. Later he said, half laughing, half honest, "When you're small, you learn early. If they're laughing at you, make them laugh with you." That gift, humor born from pain, would one day make him one of the most beloved entertainers in country music. But back then, it was just a boy, trying to survive the weight of a world too big for him. By his late teens, Jimmy started performing on small radio stations across West Virginia. He sang love songs and hillbilly ballads, his voice trembling but true. Each time he sang, people stopped working. They listened. That's when he knew, even if he was small, his voice could fill a room. It was the start of something no one could have imagined, a journey that would take him from the Appalachian hills to the grandest stages of the world. But before the lights, before the rhinestones, there was just Jimmy, a tiny boy, barefoot, singing his heart out under a tin roof. By the time America entered the 1940s, Jimmy Dickens was already chasing a dream most folks in West Virginia didn't believe in. He packed his guitar, left his hometown, and took a bus to the nearest big city, Cincinnati, Ohio, where the radio towers lit up the night like beacons of hope. He played anywhere that would have him, barn dances, roadside bars, even school auditoriums. His voice wasn't the strongest, but it was sincere, the kind that made you stop whatever you were doing and just listen. And his small size became part of his magic. Crowds laughed when he first walked on stage, but within minutes they were clapping and crying. In 1948, fate finally caught up with him. A young Hank Williams heard Jimmy on the radio and told the Grand Ole Opry about the little man with the big sound. Not long after, Dickens was invited to Nashville, the Opry, the holy temple of country music. The first night he stepped on that stage, the lights felt blinding. But when he sang, "Take an Old Cold Tater and Wait," the audience exploded. He wasn't just funny anymore, he was electric. From there, everything changed. Hit records, national tours, and appearances alongside legends like Roy Acuff and Minnie Pearl. He became known for his rhinestone suits, glittering symbols of joy in a world still recovering from war. But even as fame grew, Dickens stayed grounded. He never drank, rarely partied, and always called home to his wife. To him, country music was a promise to stay true to where you came from. Still, something inside him began to shift. As the 1950s rolled into the 1960s, a new sound was taking over America. Elvis Presley, rock and roll, and a culture that worshiped youth. Country music suddenly felt small again. Jimmy Dickens, once the bright light of Nashville, started looking beyond America. If the world wasn't coming to him, maybe he would take country music to the world. In 1964, he did something no country star had ever done before. He went on a world tour. From Hawaii to Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Turkey, Denmark, and West Germany. Everywhere he went, people cheered. They didn't understand the lyrics, but they understood him. That tour would quietly make history. A small man with a big smile had just carried the soul of America across oceans. But history can be cruel, because sometimes the first to open the door is the first to be forgotten.
Fame, as Jimmy once said, is like smoke in the wind. You can see it, but you can't hold it. By the late 1960s, Nashville had changed. The city that once adored Little Jimmy Dickens now looked toward new faces, taller, younger, louder. Rock and roll had swept the airwaves, and country was evolving into something slicker, faster, more commercial. Jimmy, with his jokes and sparkly suits, started to look like a relic from another era. He still performed, night after night, but the crowds grew smaller. The lights that once burned bright on the Opry stage began to dim, and behind the curtain, he sat alone more often. Friends like Hank Williams were long gone. The laughter that had always filled his world started to sound hollow. He didn't fall into the scandals that consumed so many of his peers. No drugs, no arrests, no affairs. His demons were quieter. Loneliness, irrelevance, the pain of watching his music fade from memory. Sometimes younger singers would greet him backstage, half out of respect, half out of pity. He would smile, that same wide, boyish grin, and say, "Don't feel bad for me, son. I had my time." But his eyes said something else, something heavier. In the 1970s, he tried to adapt, recording modern country tracks, appearing on talk shows, even poking fun at his height in TV sketches. But deep down, he missed the rawness, the simplicity, the music that once spoke to miners and mothers, not marketing departments. And yet he never stopped showing up. Every weekend, even when his health began to fade, he'd dress up in his rhinestone suit, tie his bolo, and take the stage. He'd joke, he'd sing, and for a few minutes he was still Little Jimmy Dickens, the man who made country smile. But behind that shine was exhaustion. He once told a friend off camera, "It's hard, you know, when people remember your jokes but forget your songs." There were nights when he sat in his dressing room long after the crowd had left, looking at his reflection, old and small, surrounded by trophies that meant less and less. He wasn't bitter, he was tired. The world he helped build had moved on without him. And yet, he couldn't stop showing up. Because for Jimmy Dickens, the stage wasn't just work, it was home.
By the winter of 2014, little Jimmy Dickens was 94 years old. He could barely walk without help, but he refused to stop performing. The Grand Ole Opry, his second home, invited him back for one more night, one last appearance before the year's end. That December evening, the audience rose to their feet as the curtains opened. He walked slowly toward the microphone, every rhinestone on his jacket glimmering like tiny stars. When he spoke, his voice cracked, not from age, but from the weight of everything he'd carried for nearly 8 decades. He sang "Out Behind the Barn" and a medley of old songs, joking between verses as he always did. The laughter came, but it felt different, softer, more fragile. Even the band knew they were witnessing a goodbye. 2 weeks later, he was admitted to the hospital in Nashville. Complications, fatigue, his body was giving up, but his spirit wasn't. He greeted every nurse with the same line, "How's my audience today?" Friends came to visit, one by one. Vince Gill, Brad Paisley, Carrie Underwood, they all called him Mr. Dickens. He smiled and said, "Don't you dare call me Mr. I'm still Lil Jimmy." On January 2nd, 2015, he passed away peacefully. But before he slipped away, he spoke one final confession to a close friend who held his hand. "I used to think applause was love, but love's what stays after the clapping stops." Those words would echo through the Opry halls for years to come. When news of his death spread, Nashville went silent. The lights at the Grand Ole Opry dimmed that night, the same lights that had shone on him for 70 years. In that silence, an entire generation of artists realized they hadn't just lost a legend, they'd lost the man who made them believe country music could belong to the whole world. In the years after his passing, Nashville still speaks his name in quiet reverence. You can see his face on the walls of the Grand Ole Opry, smiling down from old photographs. The little man who once made the whole world laugh. But for those who knew him, Jimmy Dickens was more than a performer. He was proof that joy can come from pain, that laughter can be a shield, and that music can travel farther than any fame. He never filled stadiums like Elvis or Johnny Cash, yet he did something no one else had dared. He carried the voice of country music across oceans and into hearts that had never heard a steel guitar before. His legacy isn't measured in records sold or awards won.
It lives in every small-town singer who steps on stage, trembling, believing that size doesn't define power, heart does. And in every artist who finds courage to keep smiling through the noise, there's a little bit of Jimmy Dickens still alive. He once said, "Fame fades, but kindness lasts longer than applause." That's the truth he left behind. And maybe that's what country music and the world needed to hear all along.